All right, welcome to today's Hinckley Forum. My name is Nahum Taddessa, and I will be the forum host for today's conversation. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is presented in partnership with the Asia Center at the University of Utah. The Asia Center is a Title VI National Resource Center for Asian and Pacific Studies. The center serves as a hub for Asian-related activities at the University of Utah, involving teaching, research, events, and outreach to K-12 schools and the broader community. The Asia Center supports Asian studies in its broadest sense, incorporating the languages and countries of the core regions of East, South, Southeast, and Central Asia, as well as Russia, the Pacific, and West Asia. We would like to thank our media sponsor, KCPW, for recording and rebroadcasting our forums as part of the Hinckley Radio Hour. Today's forum is on losing Afghanistan to on the installment plan. If you have any questions, please enter them in the YouTube chat. And with that, I will turn my time over to Kim Kornick, the director for the Asia Center here at the University of Utah, to introduce our special guest.
Thank you, Nahum, for that introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. The Asia Center and Hinckley Institute are honored to welcome Dr. Christine Fair to present today's forum. Professor Fair joins us from Georgetown University, where she is professor in the Peace and Security Studies program within the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. Prior to her appointment at Georgetown, she served as a senior political scientist with the RAND Corporation, a political officer with the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan and Kabul, and a senior research associate at the United States Institute of Peace Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention. She has also served as a senior fellow at West Point's Combating Terrorism Center, a senior resident fellow at the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis in New Delhi, and as a Reagan Faisal Democracy Fellow. Dr. Fair's research focuses on political and military affairs in South Asia. She has published numerous books on these topics, including In Their Own Words, Understanding the Lashkar-e-Taiba, Fighting to the End, the Pakistan Army's Way of War, Pakistan's Enduring Challenges, Policing Insurgencies, Cops as Counterinsurgents, Treading on Hallowed Ground, Counterinsurgency Operations in Sacred Spaces, among others. And she's currently working on a co-authorship project titled Militant Piety and Lines of Control, the Literature of the Lashkar-e-Taiba. With a PhD in South Asian languages and civilizations, as well as MA degrees in both South Asian languages and civilizations and public policy, all from the University of Chicago, Professor Fair's research and policy analysis is deeply rooted in South Asian regional history and politics. Her commentary appears frequently in print, radio, and television journalism, from the New York Times to Foreign Affairs, BBC, Al Jazeera, CNN, and others. She has also taken bold stances in her field, and we can see this in her blog posts and some of the actions she has taken with respect to addressing diversity in leading policy circles. And as her website notes and her blog posts attest, she can cause trouble, or we might say good trouble, in multiple languages, including Hindi, Punjabi, and Urdu. So for all these reasons, we are thrilled to have her join us today. And without further ado, we turn the mic and the screen over to Professor Fair as she discusses losing Afghanistan on the installment plan. So welcome, Professor Fair, and we will ask you to take the screen and the mic.
Great. Well, thank you for that very generous introduction. I do get in trouble a lot. That I can attest to. Okay. Can you see the screen? Is that okay?
We can see it.
Okay. All right, so the title is fairly self-explanatory. So I've had the, I guess we'll say the privilege, not the pleasure, of watching this battle, or these sets of wars, if you will, play out in Afghanistan over the last 20 years when 9/11 happened, I was a baby analyst at RAND, and for better or for worse, that kind of gave me at least a front lawn chair to the way in which different parts of the US government were thinking about this problem. And regrettably, most of the insights I had from that front lawn chair vantage point were not entirely reassuring. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the next 40 minutes or so. So this is a picture of Afghanistan in 1996. What I probably need to say for a general audience that are not, Afghan history nerds, that if you were paying attention to what happened in the last 2 months, you will have noticed a very predominant role of Pakistan. If you talk to Afghans, they will attest that there were Pakistani military units thoroughly embedded with the Taliban, including members of what's called the Special Services Group, which are essentially Pakistani special forces. And that this, in fact, was nothing new. If you went back to the early days of the war and you spoke to our own special operators that were there, they can tell you about the very extensive presence of Pakistani forces that were embedded with the Taliban. And in fact, there was this really important airlift called the Kunduz airlift, where Pakistanis had requested that they be able to use C-17s to get Pakistani intelligence trainers. The Pakistani intelligence organization is called the ISI. But in fact, what happened in the course of the Kunduz airlift was that not only did the Pakistanis airlift out their intelligence trainers with the ISI, but they also airlifted out innumerable Taliban that had been training with them. And this is an important part of the story because one of the things that Pakistan likes to tell audiences that are not necessarily conversant with the history of Afghanistan is that Pakistan's interest in Afghanistan began only with what they called the American-led jihad against the Soviet Union following the Soviet invasion on Christmas Eve of 1979. As with a lot of the Pakistani talking points, this is not remotely accurate. In fact, for a number of reasons, much of which are due to Afghans' own miscalculations, the Pakistanis have been pursuing a security competition with Afghanistan going back to at least the late 1950s. This had a lot to do with the position of Afghanistan when Pakistan, along with India, became independent in 1947. The Afghans had argued that Pakistan was an illegal successor state. And as such, the previous agreements that different Afghan rulers, most notably the 19th century King Abdul Rahman, had made with the British were now vacant or vacated and were no longer binding upon the Afghan state. And one of the most important agreements that the Afghans had hoped to vacate was the 19th century treaty or border agreement with the British that set the Durand Line as the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And this was something that was very unacceptable to Pakistan, to say the least. The Afghans also had rejected Pakistan's admission to the United Nations. That was a position that they would later reverse. And despite British reassurances that Pakistan was in fact a legal successor state and those agreements were still binding upon Afghanistan in Pakistan's repudiation of the Durand Line, Afghan forces even invaded parts of Pakistan in Balochistan and the federally administered tribal areas. So Afghanistan essentially got off on a really bad foot with Pakistan. And despite the passage of all of these decades, Afghanistan hasn't really come to see any light or even in any understanding of how these untenable positions have created for it really an unwinnable security competition with Pakistan. Pakistan's approach to this problem set on the other hand, has really been reprehensible. And I use that word with full justification. So the way Pakistan decided it was going to try to manage the Afghan problem set, it has a lot of similarities to what it did also in India. First, it began developing Islamist proxies, and the proxy of choice for the Pakistanis was Jamaat Islami. And by the time we get to 1970, Jamaat Islami is fully ensconced in Kabul University. Political Islam tends to be a project of the urban intelligentsia, and there's certainly no exception here in Afghanistan. And this Jamaat Islami milieu would give rise to the early Mujahideen leadership like Ahmad Shah Massoud, Rabbani, and so forth. So by the time we get to, as I said, the early 70s, when Jamaat Islami is fully taken root in Kabul at Kabul University, the Pakistan that exists is quite different from the Pakistan that came into existence in 1947. Most notably as a result of the 1971 war, which began as an internal civil war where a majority of Pakistanis who happened to be largely Bengali and living in East Pakistan rebelled against the state and seceded against the state, eventually beginning in the summer of 1971, but formally in December of 1971, India would enter the war and would decisively defeat Pakistan, leading to the emergence of East Pakistan as an independent Bangladesh. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto would emerge as essentially the civilian autocrat that would run that state. And having lost half of Pakistan's population and about 15% of its territory, which was among the most cultivatable and arable of the territory prior to the loss of East Pakistan, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was really not in the mood to tolerate any of Afghanistan's shenanigans. And those shenanigans were substantial. There was at the time an ongoing insurgency in Balochistan. The Afghans supported it. The Afghans continued to raise the issue of the Dram Line. The Afghans continued to support Pashtun irredentism. So in 1973, Muhammad Dawood ousted his cousin, King Zahir Shah. Ostensibly, one of the reasons for this ouster is that King Zahir Shah was not proceeding with modernization programs as rapidly as was desired. And so Dawood, as he was called, with Russian backing and Russian support, began a very aggressive modernization campaign that focused on land reforms, trying to discourage Afghan women from observing purdah and the very Afghan specific hijab, it looks like a blue shuttlecock. So Islamists really did not respond well to these ever more aggressive modernization overtures of Dawood. And you can see from this map, right? So these areas in the south, all the way, basically, essentially this green belt, largely Pashtun dominated. The Pashtun Islamists began fleeing into Pakistan. This is Kandahar, it's right across the street from Quetta. They began moving into a series of areas in the tribal agency, essentially fleeing fairly brutal crackdown of Dawood. So Zulfikar Ali Bhutto at this time saw an opportunity to really get revenge on Afghanistan. So as those Islamists were fleeing into Pakistan, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in 1973 sets up this Afghan cell. And the whole goal of this Afghan cell would be to turn these different rebel groups into functional and viable Islamist militant groups. After Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was ousted in a coup, and he would eventually be assassinated by the person who committed the coup, General Zia al-Haq, Zia al-Haq would continue this policy. So by the time the Soviets actually intervened in Afghanistan, Pakistan had already been running these Islamist militant operations and had trained, approximately 5,000 or so militants well before the Soviet invasion. So Pakistan under Zia was trying to seek American support for this. The president at the time was Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was not a tremendous fan of Zia ul Haq. Carter was a pretty rigorous non-proliferation president. And US intelligence had already detected that Pakistan was well on its way to pursuing a nuclear capability. And in fact, this capability was initiated by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and Zia continued with it. So in April of 79, Jimmy Carter actually sanctions Pakistan, and this would make trying to get security assistance to Pakistan very, very difficult after the Soviets invaded. So Pakistan likes to tell the story that the anti-Soviet jihad was somehow an American machination. That just simply isn't true. Afghanistan really wasn't even on the radar screen of the Americans because we had other things that we were very much concerned about, namely the developments in Iran, what would become the Iran-Iraq war. And then, of course, for all of us of a certain age, we'll remember OPEC, which was essentially the Middle Eastern oil producers to raise prices, essentially dramatically cutting back crude production. And so as a young girl, I remember, sitting in the family grossmobile, as I called it, in hours waiting for fuel. And my stepfather, he was so abstemious with not wasting gas that he wouldn't even have, the car on, and he would have us push the car, the inches that it was making towards the fuel pumps. So we literally didn't see this coming. But by the time the summer of April 79, about 2 to 3 months later after we imposed these sanctions, it's really apparent that things are going south in Afghanistan and that the United States had to really turn its attention to those developments. So from that point onward, it becomes fairly well known what happens. President Reagan is elected. He becomes very much a Cold Warrior. He does not have the hesitation in working with President Zia that Jimmy Carter had. And at this point, the Americans are full-fledged collaborators in this conflict with the British, with the Pakistanis. The Saudis, for every dollar that the Americans put towards the so-called anti-Soviet jihad, they're matching it dollar for dollar. The Chinese are also participating in this. They are providing the weapons. It was the US, of course, could not directly supply weapons to the so-called Mujahideen, which again, these groups were already in place long before the Soviets had invaded. And the reason for that is that we wanted it to be a proxy war. So the introduction of American weapons would denude this conflict of the patina that it was in fact not a proxy war, when in fact it was. So 1988, the Geneva Accords are signed. The Americans withdraw from Afghanistan. The Soviets, however, when the Geneva conventions are signed, they install Najibullah as the president of Afghanistan. He's essentially a Soviet stooge, but he's a really good Soviet stooge. He's actually, he was previously the head of Afghan intelligence. And the Soviets, unlike the Americans in the last 2 months, they actually had a planned withdrawal, and they were certain to put into place a government that would have some staying power, even though everyone at the time understood that Pakistan was really quite angry that there was not Mujahideen leadership installed, because Pakistan viewed that the Mujahideen had won this conflict, obviously with the support of the United States, Saudi Arabia, China, and Pakistan. So the Pakistanis threw everything it had at Najibullah in an effort to bring his government down, but Najibullah had really tremendous staying power. And part of the success story was that the Soviets continued to pay him to run his government. They continued to provide military trainers, they provided food, they provide myriad economic resources, and they continued to make those payments and to provide those services and goods. And so the Soviet Union collapsed, and the Russian state that emerged was unable to continue making those payments and providing those goods and services, after which Najibullah fell pretty quickly. And this was in 1992. So Afghanistan went through this period of civil war Pakistan was continuing to back one leader in particular, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, but he failed to deliver on things that the Pakistanis most valued, such as, for an example, an agreement on the Durand Line. And so sometime around 1993, the Taliban emerged. They're called the Taliban, it's Persian, and it's the Perso-Arabic plural for students. And the name comes from the fact that many of them had grown up in these religious seminaries, madrasas of a particular persuasion. They were tied to the Deobandi religious tradition in Pakistan. And they began their operations in Kandahar. And some of the first things that they did that brought some notoriety to the Pakistanis was that they began taking on these warlords that were engaging in pretty gross human rights abuses. One of the things that they did was that they were notorious for taking young boys from families and using them as essentially as catamites. The other thing that the Taliban put an end to was the usurious taxes that the different warlords would establish as people or trucks or cars would move from one warlord to another. And when the Pakistanis saw the emerging efficacy of this Taliban group against the erstwhile, warlords, for lack of a better word, the Pakistanis threw all of their might behind the Taliban. They provided them every manner of military support, financial support, diplomatic and political support. And by the time we get to 1996, the Taliban were able to consolidate their control over much of Afghanistan. By the time we get to 1998, they have taken control over almost all of Afghanistan, minus a fairly limited territory known as Panjshir. These maps give you a sense of what the dispensation in terms of the power in Afghanistan were as late as 1996. So we know what happened on September 11th, 2001. We know that the United States is attacked. We know, however, that from the time that George Bush came into office, he was very interested and indeed had already set the American governmental apparatus on a course of war with Iraq. And, I studied this stuff for a living. There really hasn't been a coherent explanation of why Bush was so dedicated to going to war with Iraq. Rumsfeld quipped that Afghanistan was going to have to be a speed bump on the way to invading Iraq because the American public expected some kind of action in Afghanistan because of 9/11. There just really hasn't been a good account of why the Bush administration was so interested in this. There's been lots of conspiracy theories, but there just hasn't really been a really good account of what was the motivation for that conflict. But because of his interest in invading Iraq, some really early decisions were made by the Bush administration. The first of which was that there was going to be a very swift military imposed solution. There were other options that were available at the time. For example, Pakistan requested more time to negotiate with the Taliban in hopes that Taliban would hand over Osama bin Laden. That was taken off the table. There were law and order approaches that were also taken off the table. In other words, instead of thinking about Osama bin Laden is the world's most dangerous terrorist, but just to instead think of him as a criminal and proceeding with the kinds of institutional arrangements that we have within the rubric of international law to bring this international criminal to justice. There was also a large-scale planned military response. That too was taken off the table. And what instead the Bush administration ended up settling on was essentially a CIA-led invasion with a very small number of what were called special operators that were working with the Northern Alliance. And to go back to this map, when we talk about the Northern Alliance, at this point, we're really talking about the Massoud territory under then leader Ahmad Shah Massoud. But what Al-Qaeda did that was actually pretty clever, contrary to what a lot of people think, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, they weren't terribly close. And so on the eve of 9/11, on September 9th, Al-Qaeda commits the very first suicide attack in Afghanistan. There had never previously been a suicide attack in Afghanistan to eliminate Ahmad Shah Massoud. Ahmad Shah Massoud doesn't die in Afghanistan. He actually dies in an Indian field hospital in Fokar Aini. And this is an important part that the Americans, this was the beginning of the Americans just not understanding what they had stumbled into. Part of the reason Musharraf was willing to lend what, at least at the time, appeared to be his unstinting support for this conflict was that the Americans had allowed him to believe, given him assurances, it depends on which American official you talk to, how committed they are to this language of assurance versus he had believed it and they did not do anything to disabuse him of these beliefs. But there were essentially three operating assumptions that Musharraf had, and he had reason to believe the Americans were on board with them. The first was that the Americans were not going to let the Northern Alliance take Kabul. The second one was that the unfinished Pakistani agenda of Kashmir would garner some American attention. And the third was that the Pakistani strategic assets or its nuclear program would remain unimpeded. So the first issue with the Northern Alliance was really important because, as I indicated, Ahmad Shah Massoud died in an Indian field hospital. So from Pakistan's point of view, the Northern Alliance, which was the only substantive resistance to the Taliban on 9/11, they were supported by the Iranians, the Russians, the Tajiks, and of course the Indians. The Indians were really committed to supporting Ahmad Shah Massoud. They had a brigadier level defense advisor. I actually met at least one, if not two, of those brigadiers. India's external intelligence agency had an aviation wing. They helped, because they were basically flying the same helicopters, they helped Ahmad Shah Massoud keep those assets in the air. So what Musharraf was basically saying is that the Northern Alliance is an Indian proxy and the Taliban are our proxy. We don't want you to hand the keys over to the Indian proxy. And the Americans just didn't understand this. And those of us who did, when we tried to explain this, we were basically met with blank stares. So to make a long story short, that's exactly what happened. The very small team of special operators led by the CIA working with the Northern Alliance, they were unable to stop the Northern Alliance from taking Kabul. And this would be one of the first of many developments in Afghanistan that would certainly reassure Musharraf that this deal with the Americans was not going to be long-lived. And not too long after that, even though Musharraf was still being handsomely compensated to work with us, the Pakistani state began pretty quickly to begin undermining us. And by the time we get to 2005, which is roughly contemporaneous with the cementing of the US-India very bomb-friendly civilian nuclear deal, Pakistan is fully working with the Taliban to undermine the US and NATO presence in Afghanistan. So all the while, the Americans are just not wanting to see this. George Bush was very fond of Musharraf. He was incapable of believing otherwise. And there were other missteps that created an environment that was very propitious for this Pakistan-backed project of the Taliban to really emerge in Afghanistan and pose what would be essentially a 15, 16-year-long effort to regain Afghanistan. And of course, as we've seen in the last several months, they would eventually prevail. But one of the things that Secretary Rumsfeld did, and it was very reminiscent of what he did also in Iraq, was that he wanted the invasion to proceed, even though there was not even the remotest clue of what the country would look like after the Taliban fell. This is exactly what happened in Iraq. There was never any plans for after Saddam Hussein fell. What would happen? What would the the post-Taliban government look like. The US government didn't have a plan. It didn't think it needed to have a plan before invading. And this state of affairs was unfortunately exacerbated by the fact that the Taliban fell much more quickly than the Americans anticipated. Again, speaking to the paucity of expertise on Afghanistan at the time in the US government. And the reason for this was clear. After the US essentially sanctioned Pakistan in 1990, withdrew from Afghanistan following the 1988 Geneva Accords, for all intents and purposes, there was no reason to retain South Asian expertise across the US government. And many of them were simply incentivized to retire or to repurpose and study conflicts that were much more salient at the time. And the reason why the Taliban fell so quickly is the same reason why the Taliban were able to become so powerful so quickly, which is with Pakistani support, the Taliban essentially said, we're going to give you a proposition you can't refuse. You can either fight us and die because the Pakistanis are going to help us kill you, or you can take some of this money that the Pakistanis have given us and basically join our effort to govern Afghanistan. And in the same way that the Taliban were able to confederate the loyalty of these different warlords using these blandishments that Pakistan helped to provide, the Taliban, the same commanders that were in that umbrella, they quickly assessed, rightly or wrongly, that the Americans were going to win. And in advance of being defeated, they defected. And those that wanted to stay in Afghanistan and become part of the new regime did that. And those that wanted to continue fighting went into Pakistan. And so the Americans misunderstood. They thought that they had defeated the Taliban, but all they did essentially was route them into Pakistan, where the Pakistani state would help them to revivify their movement. And in 2005, they would launch into Afghanistan and would become a perpetual threat to what the Americans and their NATO allies and Afghan partners were trying to establish in the country. Oh yeah, this is an important point. Very early on, one of the Taliban's confederates was a terrorist group called Jaish-e-Mohammed, also thoroughly backed and supported by the Pakistani state. They attacked the Indian parliament, and this caused a near war standoff between India and Pakistan. It was the largest mobilization since the 1971 war. And so Pakistani forces that had been arrayed to the west that were supposed to help the Americans who were driving Taliban and al-Qaeda into Pakistan, the Pakistanis were supposed to catch them. The language was Pakistan was supposed to be the anvil to the American hammer. Well, those forces redeployed from the west to the east. And it was during this time that many Taliban and even al-Qaeda fighters fled into Pakistan, where they would become part of this important uprising that would threaten everything that the US, the Afghans, and our NATO partners were trying to accomplish in Afghanistan. And they would continue to pose this threat until they essentially prevailed just shortly 2 months ago. Another set of issues that really sort of sealed the American failure was that the United States government kind of picked this guy, Karzai. He didn't have a lot of legitimacy. We foisted upon the Afghans a lawyer jirga, which would then in turn foist upon the Afghans a very unworkable constitution that didn't have a lot of legitimacy. In fact, in that lawyer jirga, we brought back many of the old warlords. Women and civil society actors were really quite outraged that we brought back these violence entrepreneurs largely to serve our own goals. We imposed upon Afghanistan an electoral system that was never going to produce a leader with any kind of electoral legitimacy. That system is called the single non-transferable vote. I'm happy to talk about why that was so problematic. And as the United States began very busily trying to engage in state building, there just wasn't any infrastructure there at all. And so compared to the Balkans, when state building, there were in fact enough institutions that could absorb those investments. the Americans essentially fostered this industrial scale corruption. All of these organizations were trying to execute large sums of money. To do that, they relied upon enormous institutional beltway bandits, I guess, for lack of a better word. They would in turn make sub-grants to other institutional contractors. And it just became like this layer after layer of contractors, all of whom were taking inordinate overhead. In fact, beltway bandits just blossomed around the beltway for the sole purpose of becoming managers of these funds. And execution of the project wasn't the goal, it was the execution of the monies themselves. So to hear President Biden, for example, speak of the cesspool of Afghan corruption, but without understanding that the Americans really helped to build that corruption, has been something that was very difficult to hear. And of course, the corruption really was a factor that was driving the insurgency. And at no point did the Americans do anything to stem that corruption, because ultimately we were able to use that corruption for our own purposes. We also spent a lot of time focusing on the sheer numbers of troops in the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, such as the Afghan National Army, but we were never able to think about quality. So the Afghans, when we came in, they're largely illiterate, they were innumerate. You can't really build a competent modern military off the, from this kind of human capital endowment. The Russians, they had a far less grievous situation because, in fact, there had been, for many decades prior to their invasion, a number of modernizing leaders that had been somewhat successful in providing an elite group of educated Afghans. But from the Soviet invasion to 9/11, the Afghan educational system was in perpetual disarray. And the Russians brought thousands of Afghan military personnel to the Soviet Union or to other satellite states where they could study. We never did any of that. In addition to that, we had a lot of opium addiction that we also could never come up with a way to manage. And we had a lot of ghost soldiers, which is to say commanders were paid the salaries of soldiers that existed in a database, but they didn't actually exist on the ground. And we were happy with that because we were able to use this corruption mechanism as a differential award for commanders that worked with us. So when people ask, why did the Afghan National Army disintegrate? Well, it's actually fairly straightforward. They were never terribly competent to begin with. They were also massively under-resourced with indigenous capabilities. If we could not succeed in building a competent army, we certainly failed in every respect to build a competent indigenous Air Force component. And we were adamant that Afghans use our weapon system because this was going to be an economic activity that generated benefits for the United States. In the same way that these layers of contractors were able to take about 90 cents of every dollar allocated to Afghanistan and route them back to the US economy, by having the Afghans on our weapon systems, it also created jobs back home. The problem is our weapon systems were completely ill-suited for a largely illiterate and innumerate military such as Afghanistan. There's a reason why, the Russian weapons are the weapons of choice for relatively poorly trained militias, insurgent groups, narco groups, and so forth, is that they're really easy to use, they're cheap, they're easy to maintain, and supplies for them are ubiquitous. So these Afghans were not able to do things like, for example, casualty evacuation. We were providing, and not only our armed forces personnel, but more importantly, contractors were providing casualty evacuation. If you've seen a map of Afghanistan, there's really only one way to get someone who's been grievously injured to a hospital, and that is through an airlift, specifically a helicopter airlift. We were providing all of the what's called close air support. So when the ANA came into contact with the Taliban, we would dump ordnance on the Taliban, ditto with the Islamic State. And without that close air support, the ANA were just not able to sustain casualties as they were sustaining. And on top of that, the Taliban were threatening their families. We had also not been terribly effective at teaching the Afghans really basic hazardous environment first aid. So if one of our soldiers were to be shot, they have as a part of their kit, this powder that coagulates a wound, right? The Afghans didn't have any of this. If the Afghans got shot in the leg, they'd throw the guy in a Hilux. By the time he reached any place where he might even get a modicum of care, he would bleed out. So, these are just some of the problems. So when the Americans withdrew the close air support, the casualty evacuation, American contractors were providing maintenance to all of these complicated systems. The Afghans, it's not that they weren't willing to fight, they were simply unable to fight. And that partly explains why, not partly, it almost entirely explains why the ANA, dissipated so quickly. Finally, even if we had retained that position, which many people had expected Biden to maintain because he was sort of committed to retaining what he called the counterterrorism plus presence, the ANA, they were losing about 40 people per day. And so being able to fill those people once they had been lost to battlefield injuries, that was never going to be possible unless the Americans had finally gotten their act together and began coercing the Pakistanis to stop supporting the Taliban in every way, shape, or form. Without this Pakistani support, the Taliban would have been a nuisance. They would not have been this very effective organization. So why was it that the Americans weren't able to see, this Pakistan problem? There are a lot of reasons for that. I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. But because the Americans were unable and or unwilling to deal with the Pakistan problem, it kept developing these workarounds that ironically increase our dependence upon the Pakistanis. So, for example, the surge in 2009. We were losing this battle because of Pakistan, and the surge made us more dependent upon Afghanistan because all of the supplies that we needed to resupply the conflict were coming through Pakistani air and ground space. And then, of course, the Pakistanis were continuously lying to various US officials about what they were and what they weren't doing. And many of those lies were actually passed on to the Americans. I can't tell you how many briefings I saw from various commanders of NATO forces in Afghanistan say one time, one lie after another, we're going to do this and this is surely going to win. In fact, I think it was last week, there was finally some fairly forthright testimony on the Hill about what went wrong. And, I just found myself in astonishment. If any of these generals had been this honest when it actually mattered, maybe we would have found ourselves in a different position. So I will shut up now. I think, oh crap, I completely overextended my yammering mandate, but open it up to Q&A.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Christine, for diving into the history and sharing your observations on what's been unfolding. I think we do have a few questions from the audience. One specific question, you had mentioned I think you said the single non-transferable vote and the state building error with the Constitution. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about, what within the context, what are the specific problems there?
Yeah, so, so Americans that were a part of this process, they'll say that I'm being ungenerous and unkind and unfair and so forth. But the more they howl, the more I know I'm right, because I was a part of it. Like, we picked the Loya Jirga. We wanted the Loya Jirga that was going to be loyal to us, as Almay Khalilzad was a part of that process. And so we wanted a strong president. We wanted our man in Kabul. What we did not want was one of those obstreperous, oversight providing legislatures. So Karzai didn't want political parties. We were like, sure, no political parties. Political parties are what makes political parties efficacious in a democratic system is that they essentially vertically integrate positions. And so you don't have to form a new coalition every time you want to pursue something in a legislature. But that was exactly what Karzai wanted. He didn't want an efficacious legislature that could bind him. And so we went along with that. So not having political parties really retarded the development of democratic institutions in Afghanistan, and we were complicit in that from the beginning. The single non-transferable vote is such a lousy system that only 3 countries in the world have it. The way the single non-transferable votes, and this is exacerbated by the lack of parties, there's no limit to the number of persons that can contest a constituency, and you have a single vote. So let's take the seat for Kabul in the lower house. There was something in the most recent elections, there was almost 700 candidates, 700, and each person had 1 vote. That meant that the person who won that seat had no more than 3% of the total votes, right? And there's not a runoff election. So this means that there is not going to be a race that ever produces a consensus candidate, right? It also means that vote rigging, which happens on the margin in Afghanistan, on a big margin, when you have so many candidates, you don't have to be so egregious in your rigging to shift the outcome in the favor of someone that you think might be more pliant. So the SNTV, and the other problem is that, Afghanistan's a poor country. It's not possible to redo the voter registration frequently. And so we built a system where the presidential elections and the elections to the legislative bodies are off sync. And we never fulfilled the obligation in the flawed constitution that we were going to have elections at the most local of bodies. So this was a system that was never going to produce any kind of legitimate government. And we knew this, we understood this. Rest assured that if the US government wanted to produce a more legitimate system, it would never have signed off to the SNTV. Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. And we have one question from the audience. I guess this is thinking about if it's individuals or broader systems and histories. How do you think the United States approach to Afghanistan would have gone if Al Gore had won the presidency instead of Bush? Would anything be different?
So I don't know. Honestly, I think the issue on climate change, that's a much more easy counterfactual, right? Because we know that Al Gore was committed to that. I'm old enough to remember the Al Gore fiasco. President Bush ironically ran on, we're not going to do state building anymore, right? So if you look at some of the things that happened under the Clinton watch, Republicans and Americans were very wary of this kind of American involvement. So this is just not something that I feel comfortable speculating on. It just really isn't clear. I think a lot of people at the time, I remember, being old enough, like, what if what if the Supreme Court had elected Gore instead of Bush? What would have he done differently? I think many of us at the time thought that he would have been more reticent. He certainly would not have had any interest at all in invading Iraq. That we can say with absolute certitude would not have happened. But the Americans, I don't know how old you were, but I'm north of 50, well north of 50. Americans wanted blood. Right? Even the most, and so you even saw, people like Hillary Clinton, although she didn't bother reading the national intelligence estimate, something for which I'll never forgive her. But there just was, even amongst Democrats, there was this desire for bloodletting. It was very palpable. It was very gross. It felt strange to me. And you saw this, this sort of national catharsis with some very crude celebrations of Osama bin Laden's demise. People just came out and were celebrating and chanting USA. So it's hard to say. I suspect that it would not have played out in the way in which it had. I mean, the invasion of Iraq really took away a lot of strategic resources. So people who were on the National Security Council at the time, they would say, look, in any given hour, we are spending 50 minutes or more on Iraq. Afghanistan gets the leftovers, and Pakistan gets the leftovers of that. So there was never any ability to really ponder what was happening. It was all being done on, essentially leftovers of attention.
And I know we're getting close to one. I have one more question, maybe just a sort of your gut reaction or quick sense of South Asian expertise in the government under Biden right now, and what are your concerns or what do you see as priorities for regional security?
So this looks like an easy question at first blush. It's actually a tougher question to answer. So the State Department, I have nothing but contempt for. I mean, I can't even look in its direction, because for much of the last 20 years, the State Department has spent much of its time going to Congress saying, don't sanction Pakistan, Pakistan this, Pakistan that. And if they had spent a fraction of that effort saying to the Pakistanis, you need to stop supporting terrorism, you need to stop using terrorism as a tool of foreign policy, you need to stop supporting the Taliban. And had they supported the anemic efforts as they were on the Hill to hold Pakistan accountable, we would be in a very different place. Zalmay Khalilzad, when Biden decided to retain him as the special representative, I knew this was going to happen. Zalmay Khalilzad had been normalizing the Taliban going back to the 1980s. He brought the Taliban 1.0 to UNICAL's headquarters in Texas, and he had been propounding at the time, as did the State Department. I had my first job in the U.S. government, first and only job in the U.S. government. I was an intern in the State Department, and I saw what the positions were, and we were supportive of the Taliban at the time, and we were hoping that they were going to allow these pipelines to happen. So I wasn't remotely surprised that Zalmay Khalilzad would continue with his project of rehabilitating the Taliban, because he's a businessman. I mean, I think someone needs to investigate how much money he has made off of the US taxpayers' dollars and how much money he will continue to make. So there's this whole cottage industry of people in his orbit, like Cheryl Bernard, and I do call people out. If you write an op-ed and you write some insipid, disgusting garbage, expect to be called out. I will call you out. Cheryl Bernard wrote this terrible piece. She's his husband. She is his wife, albeit he is a very philandering husband, but she still is in law his wife. And she wrote this terrible piece talking about how the Taliban have changed. She said that there's no confirmable information that the Taliban have kidnapped and raped women. I mean, it's like if there was an evil onion, she could be one of their South Asia writers. Most of the think tanks around DC have been co-opted by the Pakistanis. USIP, which is funded by the taxpayer, they have been Zalmay's back office. And there's nothing that they produce that's critical of Pakistan. It harbored Moeed Yusuf. I called him what he was, an ISI asset. And I was pilloried for being so mean to this poor man. But he's now Imran Khan's national security advisor, right? There's never any accountability for any of this rubbish. Scholars that need to depend upon Pakistan for visas will sing their songs. Michael Kugelman's a really good example at the Wilson Center. He was first out of the box with, oh, the Taliban are not the same Taliban. And I'm like, well, you're right about that. This is actually a far more dangerous Taliban, a more radical Taliban. It has closer ties to Al-Qaeda than Taliban 1.0, and it's closer to the Haqqani network. And it is part of the suite of assets that are controlled by the ISI along with the Islamic State. So I don't see any hope for substantive reoptimization. In fact, I see now that we've lost the embassy, the Biden administration is kind of going back to the Pakistanis, and rather than sanctioning them and telling them to knock this crap off, we're going to take away your non-NATO major ally status. We're going to put your ISI terror ringmasters under Department of Treasury sanctions. I don't see any of that. In fact, we seem to be going back to the Pakistanis and say, hey, we'd like to rent more of your snake catching expertise without ever demanding that they stop farming snakes. So my track record on this is like, I wish if I could only play the lottery as well as I predict these US-Pakistan entanglements, I wouldn't be doing the predicting of US-Pakistan entanglements. I'd retire on my lottery earnings, but I predicted it, and you already see it happening. I'm not optimistic at all. I think we're going to be back in Afghanistan, just like we were back in Iraq.
Okay, well, I think we all wish we would end on a brighter note, but we appreciate the eye-opening discussion and your ability to sort of tie this in with the past and really update us on the deep-rooted problems that are still there and do not seem to be moving in the direction we prefer. So we wish you had won that lottery.
Well, hey, thank you guys for having me. Is Ben here? Ben Cohen? I don't see him.
I don't know. So this works with a live stream, so he may be watching. And I would only know if he posted, but I know that not right now. He can view it later. So,
well, if you are Ben, I miss you and I heart you. Lots of hugs. Your dad was, all of us who work in this space, without your father, there wouldn't even be this space to work in. We all are beholden to Steve Cohen, Ben's father. And Ben himself is just a really solid South Asian as he's following in his dad's excellent footsteps.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you for giving those props and reaching out. And we're so happy you could join us, Christine. Thanks on behalf of the Hinckley Institute and the Asia Center. And we hope we will see you again in the future. Perhaps.
Inshallah. All right.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.